Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are here to take your source, all that detailed research, the critical analysis, the author's own notes, and really distill the essential insight. We want to help you get well-informed, fast, and with, hopefully, a surprising amount of clarity.
And today, we are setting our sights on a novel that is, it's massively popular, M.L. Wang's The Sword of Kaigen.
Right. And this is going to be an absolutely essential dive.
It is, because we're not just, summarizing a book that a lot of people love. We're using a really detailed critical source. It's basically a literary autopsy. Oh, absolutely. But that later book, it really faltered when the scope expanded. The structure just couldn't hold the ambition.
And The Sword of Kaigen, being an earlier book, it tries to tackle these massive stakes right from the beginning. We're talking geopolitical war, intergenerational trauma, magical combat, all in one book.
And the critique we're looking at, it suggests that the author, at that point in her development, was trying to wrestle with a scope that was just too big for the framework she had.
So, by understanding these specific points of failure, we can get these valuable shortcuts to recognizing what makes for effective narrative design, no matter the genre.
That's the goal.
Okay, so let's set the scene for you. The world is called Duna. It's a second-world sci-fi fantasy mash. The geography and the cultures, they're inspired by the Asian continents. You've got the Kinoa Empire, which is like a Korean analog.
Shirojima, which is a Japanese analog, and then the Ranganizes, which are a Chinese analog.
And our focus is on this remote, really tradition-steeped region called Takoibi. It's located in Shirojima, and it's home to the Matsuda family.
And the Matsudas are powerful Ju. They're elemental benders who control water and ice, and they are the sword of the Tainua Empire. They're this ancient warrior class that fiercely resisting modernization.
So the story's tension comes from two main perspectives. First, there's Mamoru. He's the young, idealistic son, striving to master the ancient way of the sword.
And then there's his mother, Misaki. And on paper, she is the novel's most compelling character. A former, badass crime fighter who has emotionally repressed herself.
Right. She's in this arranged, loveless marriage, living a life of traditional servitude.
And this whole complex family drama, the conflict between tradition, individual desire, trauma, it's all set against this huge external threat, a looming invasion by the technologically advanced Ranganese.
That blend of high-octane action, deep personal tragedy, and geopolitical conflict, that's inherently difficult to manage structure.
And that is precisely where the book begins to unravel.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the world itself. The source describes the setting as feeling jarring. Almost like a chaotic blend of different...
Yeah, on one hand, you have the high-flying action and the elemental powers of a classic shonen story.
And for anyone who doesn't follow anime, a shonen story is, typically about a young male protagonist. He's focused on mastery, intense training, becoming the best, usually through martial arts or special powers. Think Naruto or Avatar, Last Airbender.
That whole aesthetic is very strong, but it's existing in a world that is supposedly sci-fi. Electricity, data tablets, airplanes, high-speed rail.
So that clash... the high-tech infrastructure with this focus on traditional isolated sword-wielding warriors, that's the first major structural contradiction.
It is. Takobi is completely entrenched in traditions that feel like Japan's Tokugawa or Edo period. They actively reject modernization to maintain the, quote, purity of the samurai way of life.
I see the structural argument here. The rest of the empire has modernized, basically moving into a Meiji era level of technology. So that difference is supposed to create tension, the old versus the new.
But the critique argues it just leads to implausibility. How can an ancient warrior class, no matter how powerful they are, credibly function as the sword of the empire when that same empire has overwhelming air superiority and modern bombs?
It's a huge disconnect. The narrative never really resolves it.
It really doesn't. The Matsuda family's special weapon, the jutsu ice sword called the Whispering Blade, is legendary. It's supposed to be able to cut through any steel.
A symbol of their traditional power.
Exactly. But in a modern military conflict, the power of a blade is, it's meaningless against remote warfare. The author is asking us to accept that the spiritual power of tradition can beat the technological inevitability of...
And that just fundamentally weakens the entire structure of the conflict from the get-go.
And it gets deeper. If we look at the power structure, the critique raises some really serious questions about the magic system itself, specifically the racial coding. So the magic users are bender. You're either a Ju who controls water and ice like the Matsudas, or you're a Falu who controls wind and air like the Rang. The fundamental issue is that this power system is genetically determined and it's racially coded.
So certain families, and by extension certain Races are just inherently benders. It's tied to blood purity and lineage.
Yes, it's not about hard work or individual merit, which often the central theme of a true shonen story. It's just something you're born with.
So the critique isn't just saying that this racial coding exists, but that it introduces a really problematic structural element. You have an inherent genetic superiority that the book just doesn't interrogate properly.
Precise. The source notes that this raises, and I'm quoting here, weird kind of eugenicist thing that the book doesn't really consider the implications of. It's a common pitfall, actually.
How so?
When adult authors take world-building concepts they came up with in their teens, where, having innate cool power seems awesome, and then they try to retrofit them into complex political fiction without addressing the philosophical weight of it.
Of inherited, genetically superior abilities.
Right. If the war is about racial destiny instead of political conflict, the stakes change completely, and the narrative needs to be built around that premise from the start.
But doesn't the book try to do that? With the Empire's propaganda being about purity, and the protagonist's journey is to expose that as a lie.
It tries, yes, but the system itself undercuts the expose. Even if the propaganda is a lie, the fact remains that the Matsudas can bend ice, and the Latiga, the white people analog, are described as having very brittle bones and are very...
So the world is set up where racial superiority is an observable fact.
Yes, which makes the anti-propaganda message feel a bit hollow, because the system of power, no matter who's in charge, is still based on lineage and genetics.
And this problem bleeds right into the geopolitical setup, which the source describes as structurally uncomfortable.
Very. The Kenowa Empire is a Korean analog, Shirojima, where the story is set is a Japanese analog, and it's presented as a sad little vassal state under Kino's control. And they're both constantly threatened by the Chinese.
And when you build a fantasy world that's so closely based on specific, really sensitive historical power dynamics, especially in Asia, you have to be so careful.
You do. You have to be careful that the fictional dynamics don't accidentally reverse or trivialize complex. The critique has to report this neutrally, but the insight is clear. The fictional framework of a perpetually victimized Shirojima serving a strong Kinoa empire injects a highly charged political narrative that the fantasy structure is just ill-equipped to handle.
It makes the whole world feel unstable. It distracts from the actual character.
And speaking of distractions, we have to talk about the language. The source found the heavy inclusion of made-up Japanese words for mundane, actively frustrating.
Like damati for time.
Damati for time, ton-sama for a common title. It's immersion breaking. If you use a faux language for culturally specific, untranslatable concepts, that can enhance world building. But substituting fake words for common measurements like seconds or hours,
it just pulls you out of the story.
It forces the reader to stop, translate, and do unnecessary mental gymnastics. It reminds you that you're reading a constructed text instead of letting you sink into the reality of the setting.
So all of this, this overambition and complexity, it led to a really crucial moment of authorial self-correction, which for you listening is probably the most important takeaway from this whole section.
It is. The author stopped the planned sequels, The War of the Willoam.
Right.
Because she realized that the fundamental world-building issue, the genetically coded magic, the problematic geopolitical analogies, the inconsistencies between tradition and tech were just too flawed to sustain the larger story she wanted to tell. She recognized that continuing would mean constantly fighting against these core structural instability.
It's like realizing the foundation of your house is cracked. You can't just build a second story.
Exactly. She admitted she had to keep trying to do these side stories, like the Sword of Kaigen, to avoid confronting the fundamental problems of the wider universe. The only reason Kaigen survives is because it's separate and self-contained.
So its strength is actually its limitation.
The irony is, yes, the strength of the book lies in its self-imposed structural limitation, which just highlights how unstable the world is outside that small mountain town.
Okay, let's shift from the flaws of the macro world to the internal character, starting with Mamoru, the young son. He is the idealized classic shonen lead, isn't he?
Oh, 100%. He's young, highly motivated, relentlessly training to master the whispering.
And his arc starts to predict the standard template. Journey from blind faith and naivete towards the painful disillusionment of adulthood.
Which is a powerful narrative drive, as long as it services the larger structure.
His disillusionment gets kicked off by the arrival of Kwang Julie, the city boy northern who shows up at the mountain.
Kwang is the structural agent of change. He immediately starts challenging the entire Takobi narrative. He says the emperors are liars and that the mountain warriors are just fodder, expendable human buffer zones for the Kinoa Empire.
And the proof comes pretty quick. The inciting incident is when Mamoru and Kwang, while they're doing a cleaning punishment, They find a crashed aircraft.
And this is undeniable physical evidence. It proves the Empire lied about the last war. And just like that, Mamoru's faith is shattered.
But here's where the analysis gets really interesting, and it shows the mathematical failure of the narrative geometry.
It really does. The critique points out that Mamoru's entire journey from naivety to cynical truth seeker, which takes up a massive portion of the first half, is structurally wasted time.
Wasted? How so?
Because we, the reader, go through his whole discovery process, but his mother, Uneasy, already knows all of this. She's educated at the Daybreak Academy. She already understands the Empire's propaganda and the blood purity myths.
So if the co-protagonist already has the knowledge the younger protagonist is fighting to uncover, his discoveries don't actually reveal anything new for the reader.
Exactly. They are just two separate parallel plot threads running side by side. They never intersect in a way that benefits both.
So the two structural engines, Mamoru's learning, Misaki's knowing, they fail to work.
They do. And the critique suggests that if Kwangjulie, the catalyst for all this, had been used in the second half to connect that early political plot to the later war effort, it might have redeemed that investment. But he just away.
Leaving Mamoru's entire journey feeling isolated and ultimately redundant.
Yes, and his arc culminates in this intense, classic shonen confrontation with his father, Takeru.
Right. The father is rigid, traditional, and he blames Mamoru's inability to master the Whispering Blade on his mother's pollution.
It's high-stakes emotional drama masked as physical conflict. The father is symbolically fighting the non-traditional influence of the mother through the son, but then the author uses this sort of fixed trope. Takeru is shown to be a terrible teacher. When he storms off, Misaki, the supposed repressed housewife who isn't even allowed in the dojo, she steps in.
And in one scene, she uses her Daybreak Academy skills to completely fix Mamoru's technique. She solves this years-long struggle just like that.
It's designed as a reveal of her hidden badassery, a nice mother-son bonding, but structurally, it's an unearned shortcut. It takes Mamoru's central thematic struggle, the difficulty of mastery, and solves it in a single coach.
Which diminishes his struggle. And it also makes you question Misaki's supposed repression. If she has this kind of refined knowledge, why has she been okay with being excluded from the dojo for so long?
Right. The character moment, while cool, sacrifices structural integrity and character.
And all of this leads to the biggest pacing problem the source identifies. Mamoru's whole arc, the disillusionment, the training, the sudden fixes, it takes up a staggering 50% of the book.
50%. And for a subversion of expectations to land, and the death of the presumed protagonist is the ultimate subversion, it has to happen much, much earlier.
The critique argues 30% is the absolute maximum.
Right. If you pivot at 50%, you don't just lose time, you structurally invalidate the entire premise of the preceding half. The author spent half the novel building an emotional foundation for a character that the other main character didn't even need to complete her own journey.
So you're left asking, what was the point of all that page time?
Exactly. If the structural goal is Mamoru's death, then his life needed to be a poignant, rapidly paced lead-up. You focus on his potential, the tragedy of his naivete. You don't give him an extended, independent plot thread that's just made redundant by his mother's story. This is essential knowledge for any writer. Understanding the geometry of narrative pivots dictates the pace setup.
Okay, so shifting to Misaki. Here we have a character with just tremendous potential. She's positioned as a rare figure in this genre. An older female main character, in her 30s, a mother of 4, and a former warrior struggling with repression and lost identity.
She's supposed to be the emotional heart of the story. Her marriage to Takeru was arranged, love emotionally distant. She gave up a life of action with her fighting partner, Rob, to submit to clan tradition.
And the main focus of her internal conflict is her perceived failure as a mother. She's constantly berating herself for being emotionally repressed, for feeling separated from her son.
She believes they belong to the clan, not to her. She explicitly regrets not enjoying her time with them. But here's the central failure of the execution. That distance is only ever told to the reader. It's never convincingly shown. Misaki tells us she's distant, but the text frequently shows her intervening, coaching Mamoru, intensely grieving miscarriage.
It's a key distinction. The emotional consequences of this so-called distance are never shown from Mamoru's perspective. He never seems confused or sad about his mother's coldness.
The emotional reality the author intended, a mother isolated from her children, it just doesn't materialize on the page.
So the critique suggests a fundamental disconnect. The author had the brilliant idea of this complex, repressed character, but lacked the narrative tools to make that feeling emotionally real for the reader.
We're told she's distant, but then she acts supportive and insightful. This inconsistency just minimizes the emotional payoff when she finally decides to break free.
And this issue of agency is so critical, especially with the world's arbitrary sexism women being barred from the dojo. The source draws a really crucial comparison to Mariko from James Clavell's Shugen.
Mariko is the perfect structural counterpoint. She exists in a far more rigidly patriarchal society than Duna, yet she finds this profound agency by subverting expectations. She uses the guise of being a docile, subservient woman to execute highly sophisticated political maneuvers. She mastered the system to turn it to her own advantage.
And Misaki, by contrast, is just fundamentally reactive. She doesn't use the expectations placed on her as a docile wife to influence things creatively or subtly.
The world's sexism feels contrived. It just exists to set up a few "look how strong she really is" moments later on. It doesn't create a sophisticated political cage that she has to cleverly navigate or subvert.
And this lack of internal proactive maneuvering leads directly to what the critique calls the quick switch problem.
Her sudden turn from repressed housewife to decisive warrior ice-needling her husband and demanding change happens without any of the necessary gradual buildup. There are no small, hidden moments of rebellion.
If we had seen her, for instance, strategically withholding information from her Daybreak Academy days to undermine Takeru's authority subtly,
or if we had seen quiet acts of defiance about her son's upbringing over the years,
then the final confrontation would have felt earned, inevitable even, the culmination of years of suppressed tension.
Instead, it feels like the author just hit a plot button. Okay, the war is coming. Time for the mother to stop repressing herself. The internal struggle, which should have driven the first half, is resolved way too rapidly just to get to the battle scene.
Which brings us to that pivotal moment, the structural fault line of the entire narrative, the Ranganese attack. And this transition from the slow domestic setup to a massive, full-scale anime fight scene, it's undeniably jarring.
But it delivers the spectacle. Misaki's past training finally gets its moment. She desperately tries to warn the warriors based on her experience. Yellow uniforms are grunts, black outfits are the powerful fighters, and the coming tornado is caused by enemy Falu windbend.
And her husband, Takeru, just dismisses it all as dumb woman talk, which reinforces their internal conflict right before the external war explodes.
The battle itself is classic high-octane fantasy. Takeru and his brother Takashi create massive ice snakes and dragons. Takashi dies fighting for glory. Mamoru is assigned to protect civilians. It's a heroic traditional war.
And then the subversion hits.
Mamoru, injured, in his final moments, he masters the whisk. He cuts his enemy in half using his own blood as a catalyst. And he dies in this classic blaze of glory, cementing his legacy.
But his death creates this undeniable structural crisis. Because his journey was redundant, Misaki already knew everything he fought for. His death at the 50% mark makes all that page time structurally arbitrary.
The time spent on his POV, his hopes, his training, it's invalidated.
So what would have been a better way to handle?
The critique suggests that to really maximize the tragedy and the structural impact, Mamoru's POV should have been removed entirely, or at least minimized severely. Imagine if the first half was focused purely on Misaki, watching her son grow, realizing her distance, regretting her repression.
Or if the POV was split between Misaki and Takeru, focusing on the parental dynamic, that would make the death profound for the surviving protagonists.
Exactly. If the reader had learned about Mamoru through the eyes of his parent, that grief would serve as an engine for the second half, instead of just being an abrupt plot shift that happens to solve the structural problem of a dual protagonist arc.
And beyond the pacing, there's a massive thematic clash here that the battle just fails to navigate.
The two central narrative ideas, the heroic sacrifice story and the bleak anti-war story, they just collide violently.
The heroic last stand is classic shonen.
But the book is also trying to deliver this mature anti-war message. The empire lies, the warriors are fodder, their sacrifice is futile propaganda. You cannot have both themes land effective if the author treats the heroic sacrifice as a definitive, glorious.
And the technological inconsistency makes it so much worse. This world has planes and advanced tech, yet the climax is all ice spears and katana.
The strongest thematic choice would have been for the Ranganese to just bomb the entire area, render the traditional warrior skills meaningless, and instantly reinforce the theme utility.
Instead, we get a celebration of traditional warfare.
And this is compounded by a clumsy attempt at reconciliation later. The Ranganese attack is explained away as just a test of the warrior house. If the test worked, and the samurai did prove their worth by stopping the invasion, that completely undermines the idea that the empire was lying and using them as a meaningless buffer.
The themes just cancel each other out. It's a narrative zero-sum game.
It speaks to the limitations of the speculative magic in this context. If you have icebenders in a sci-fi world, why aren't they using their powers with modern technology? Using ice to reinforce concrete, creating storm fronts to ground enemy planes, that's smart speculative fiction.
Fighting on the ground with katanas when planes exist means the author just prioritized a cool fight scene over the internal logic and thematic cohesion of the world.
Exactly.
So if the battle was jarring, the aftermath of Mamoru's death is marked by an astounding structural and emotional failure. There is a complete lack of profound, shattering grief.
The book immediately pivots back to high-tension action or character banter. It robs the reader of the necessary space to feel that trauma. The story just struggles to let any heavy emotion.
We jump straight into Misaki fighting assassins. It's his high-tension defense of her sister-in-law, Setsuko, where she kills 9 enemies.
And then there's the deeply unsettling detail of her 5-year-old son, Hiroshi, stabbing a Falu attacker through the heart, Hana, to save. And he shows this chilling lack of a...
Wait, let's pause on that. A 5-year-old child kills a grown man with a sword, and the mother's internal thought is that he's just like his father. I mean, that is a massive thematic bomb about inherited trauma and the brutal cost of this warrior culture.
It is, but the book immediately rushes past it. It's an issue of pacing and structural placement. That moment deserves its own chapter of reflect or sustained internal reaction. Instead, it's a quick detail that just moves us to the next plot, the confrontation.
Which the critique calls the pussy-ass bitch duel.
Right. Misaki, having survived the assassin, turns her rage onto Takeru. She blames him for obeying his brother's ordered son for his subservient empire. So she challenges him to it, demanding he man up and confront.
And the problem isn't the duel itself, but the fact that it's used as a mechanism for this massive, unearned psychological revelation.
In this one single conversation and fight, Takeru's entire tragic backstory is abruptly unloaded onto the reader.
He reveals his distant mother, his abusive father, and this coping mechanism he developed, the mountain vision.
And this mountain vision is the fantasy version of psychological dissociation. It's an instantaneous coping mechanism for deep trauma that lets the traditional warrior avoid dealing with sadness by literally subsuming his consciousness, timeless.
It paralyzes him from reacting, which explains his coldness during the battle.
And crucially, the critique notes that there were no clues laid in the first half of the book to suggest Takeru was anything other than a rigid, traditional, mustache-twirling asshole. His distance was just interpreted as simple disdain.
Not a deeply rooted psychological defense.
No. This is the classic trope dump problem. The author needed Takeru to have complexity to be redeemable. But instead of layering in small moments of struggle or kindness over the first half showing, not telling, she just dropped a massive trauma backstory on us mid-fight.
Which makes the reconciliation that immediately follows feel entirely unearned.
The duel is used to solve decades of marital and emotional dysfunction instantaneous. Misaki forces him to attempt the impossible, break her sword's sheath, which is made of impossibly hard Zalonge glass, with his whispering blade, all while he's focused on raw, uncontrolled emotion.
The symbolism is powerful. He has to break the shell, the sheath, representing his repression, not with pure cold technique, but with stronger emotionally charged power.
And he succeeds. He demonstrates he's willing to abandon his repressed persona. He stops fighting and gives her the choice to kill him, symbolizing his commitment to a partner. Her refusal confirms their new, emotionally honest relationship.
But while the imagery is great, the structural weakness is obvious. The resolution relies entirely on emotional tells, and Misaki just thinks, I was so focused on myself, I didn't see that he needed me.
There was no established groundwork showing Takeru's quiet desperation. If the author had given Takeru a POV earlier, showing us his internal struggle against the mountain vision,
or if Misaki had shown small acts of empathy toward his silent pain,
then the success of the duel would have been the culmination of growth, not the catalyst for it. As it's written, it's a structural shortcut that just fails to land emotionally because the preceding character development simply wasn't there.
So after this reconciliation, the abrupt character transformations continue. Takeru immediately turns from a distant warrior into best dad and, bizarrely, a logistical genius.
It's the second rapid, unearned personality switch. The book suddenly gives him this bureaucratic competence and political savvy that was never hinted at before. He was previously obsessed only with geopurity and traditional fighting.
Right. With his brother and the governor dead, Takeru takes charge of Tagobi and develops this brilliant instantaneous plan to rebuild and, crucially, circumvent imperial authority. It shows unprecedented diplomatic skill.
He establishes a public school and government house immediately. The plan is clever Anyone who works for these public services gets a paycheck from the empire. He also uses the massive amount of felled trees from the battle as lumber to sell, creating a self-funding reconstruction effort.
It's a great example of fantasy logistics, but we spent half the book establishing this guy as rigid and tradition-bound. Doesn't this sudden bureaucratic skill feel less like earned character growth and more like the author just needed a competent mayor to run the town in the back half?
That is precisely the critique. It's a convenient plot requirement masquerading as character development. The author needed him to be a competent, caring leader for the future, so he simply becomes. It contradicts his entire established persona without any textual hint of previous hidden talent.
And this rapid administrative arc is immediately interrupted by all these extraneous elements dedicated entirely to setting up future abandoned book.
The Hiyori subplot is the first blatant. Hiyori is a woman assaulted by a Ranganese soldier. She later commits suicide. The source notes this is related to concepts of honor and shame after the battle, leaving behind her child, who just happens to be an airbender.
This tragic scene acts as a second poorly placed climax. It exists only to introduce a character, the airbending child, who would have been crucial for a future story. It offers zero thematic resolution for the Sword of Kaigen.
It's just overt, high-stakes sequel bait, fragmenting the narrative's focus.
Then there's the bizarre random appearance of a Latigo, the white animal, a chameleon assassin who appears disguised as Mamoru.
Misaki uses her ice powers to pin him and tortures him. She breaks his leg bone before he commits.
It's a random, jarring, and dark sequence that is completely disconnected from the current plot about Takaobi's autonomy.
It exists purely to set up external enemies, the Latiga, for the next book, and expand the world's scope in a deeply fragmented. It's another example of the author sacrificing immediate narrative cohesion to world build that ultimately never materialized.
And even the final scene, Robin's return, falls into this trap.
Robin, Misaki's old flame, returns purely to exchange information for his own future independent site. He details his own family struggles that are irrelevant to Misaki's immediate domestic residence.
So while the scene gives Misaki a final reflective moment, confirming she still loves Robin but is committed to her new partnership with Takeru, the primary function of the final act is overwhelmingly sequel setup.
The result is a highly fragmented conclusion that never delivers the structural closure the reader needs after all that. We needed resolution on the political fate of Takeobi and the healing of the Matsuda family. Instead, we are left with a series of cliffhangers in character introduction books that were never written.
So, to offer a final assessment of the Sword of Kaigen, the book's fundamental flaw, it seems, lies in its attempt to be structurally elastic enough to handle too many genres and ideas at once.
It wanted to be a shonen action story, a bleak anti-war narrative, a slice-of-life domestic romance, and a deep character study of trauma, all at the same time.
The author was trying to manage a scope that was just far too large for the structural framework she employed. She was trying to retrofit these sophisticated adult themes like PTSD, complex marital reconciliation, political corruption, onto world-building concepts that were conceptually simple and often genetically derived.
And the author's eventual decision to stop the sequels confirms our core analysis. The conceptual and structural foundations were just too flawed to sustain the complex story she wanted to tell. That conflict between the heroic narrative of Memory's death and the anti-war that exemplifies this perfect failure of narrative.
The journey through this book, then, becomes a powerful lesson in structural integrity for you, the listener. It really demonstrates the importance of making sure every part of your story serves the central engine. If Mamoru's arc was redundant because Misaki already possessed the knowledge, then that arc failed to perform its essential duty.
So what does this all mean for narrative design? We return to the central structural question raised by this deep dive. If the death of a main character is intended to be the pivotal, transformative moment, how early must the foundational characters be introduced and developed to ensure that tragedy feels earned, structurally necessary, and
if the pivot occurs too late, as it did here at the 50% mark, the author risked invalidating all the preceding time. If the pivotal character is removed, the remaining protagonists must immediately use that lock as a catalyst for a journey that they couldn't have undertaken otherwise.
The core lesson here is understanding the math of narrative gear shift. Why a 30% pivot is usually structurally more effective than a 50% one, because that knowledge dictates whether a tragic death serves the plot or becomes the structure.
And here's a final provocative thought for you to consider. In a story that attempts to expose the futility of traditional warrior codes against modern warfare, should the climax ever involve the successful use of those outdated traditional skills?
Or does the structure demand that the warriors fail in spectacular, crushing fashion for the anti-war theme to land without controversy?
Something to mull over until our next deep dive. Thanks for listening.